terrified tales, where the rain falls slow and the fear creeps in quicker. Like and subscribe before we begin, and tell us where and when you're listening. Midnight, alone, that's when they find you. Story 1. The road narrowed just past the Nettlewick sign, where the hedgerows swallowed the sky and the fog began to move with purpose. Dr. Isla Trenholm tapped the brakes and leaned forward, trying to make out the curve ahead, but the headlights only lit a pale wall of mist. Her phone had lost signal an hour back, and the GPS had stopped speaking altogether, as if it too had decided she was somewhere not meant to be mapped. She hadn't wanted the job. But grief counselors with licenses, quiet voices, and no family left to anchor them didn't get to pick. The girl's case had come through the county office flagged as potentially high risk. 13 years old, recent maternal loss, speaking to voices, refusing to leave a cemetery, the usual red lights. What made Isla accept, what always made her accept, was the kind of detail no intake form ever knew to list. Naomi Wren had mentioned a name, Isla's sister's name, not in full, not directly. Just one phrase, recorded by a school psychologist and transcribed in neat black font on a scan of yellowed notebook paper. She says the name Mara sounds better when it's whispered under the 13th stone. Isla hadn't heard that name, spoken aloud in 6 years. Not since the suicide. Not since Mara's voice, scratchy and panicked, left a final voicemail that Isla didn't return. She found the rental cottage just past a break in the trees, where the forest thinned into cliffside. Grass. It was a single-story structure, low-ceilinged and black-timbered, with warped window panes and a small wooden gate leading nowhere. The sea was invisible in the fog, but she could smell it. Salt and kelp and something older, rotting, buried too long. Inside, the cottage was dry and dim. Everything smelled of lavender and old plaster. A thick quilt lay folded over the foot of the bed, and the hearth still held the blackened bones of a recent fire. She set down her bag and opened the curtains, only to find the fog pressed up against the glass like breath. That night, just past midnight, she heard a tap, then another. Isla sat up in bed, another tap. She went to the front door, slowly, her bare feet cold on the flagstone floor. Nothing outside but white. She turned on the porch light. Something was resting in the middle of the threshold, a small stone. Oval, river-worn, pale grey. Perfectly ordinary, except for the words etched in its surface, as if with a needle, Mara, and beneath it, a date. 2 days from now. By morning, the fog hadn't lifted. It had thickened, pooled lower to the earth as if unwilling to release what it held. The stone still sat on Isla's doorstep. She hadn't touched it, hadn't even opened the door, just stared at it from behind the glass, the way one might stare at a snake that had curled up politely outside one's home. She told herself it was a coincidence, a cruel one, a trick played by a stranger with too much access or too much time. But the engraving was not fresh. The letters had been worn, faded slightly, like they'd been there for years. She left it there. The school was less than a mile inland, set between a post office and a chapel that had lost its cross. Naomi wasn't in class. A woman named Headmistress Croad, pale and cold as the fog itself, handed Isla a folder and offered nothing but clipped comments about outbursts and attention-seeking behaviors. Isla flipped the folder open. Naomi's most recent drawing, a field of graves, each marked with numbers, except one at the bottom corner, labelled mine. They said she spent most of her days by the cemetery now, Mourner's Field. The locals didn't call it that. In their mouths, it became the Old Patch, or that cursed bit by the cliffs. But its real name was older than the maps. Isla knew it before she saw it, because she had dreamt it once. A circle of crooked stones leaning toward each other, like conspirators. A field where sound went thin. a place where her sister had once knelt as a child, pretending to listen for the voices of angels. The gate was unlatched. The wind here didn't whistle, it murmured. She stepped through. 12 stones, arranged irregularly, not in a row, not in any clear pattern. One sat at the foot of an old yew, another nearly buried by creeping moss. No names, no dates, just time-worn slabs of stone that barely looked touched, except for one thing. A man. He stood at the far edge of the field near the cliff's lip. Silent, motionless, dressed in an oilskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. In his gloved hands, a rusted spade. Isla hesitated, then approached. The closer she got, the more details came into focus. His face was aged but tight with tension. His throat bore a thick, winding scar that wrapped around from ear to collar like something had been sewn shut. His eyes, clear, wintry blue, did not blink. He gestured to her, held out his palm, a notepad, roughly torn pages stained with damp earth. She took it, read. "You don't speak in the field." She stared at him. "I'm not here for a tour." The man didn't flinch. Isla turned her gaze back to the gravestones. 13 graves, she said. The man's head tilted. "No," she asked. "There were 13, weren't there?" His eyes narrowed. Then he moved, not toward her, past her. He walked to a bare patch of grass near the edge, pressed the heel of his boot into the soil, knelt. With slow, careful movements, he began to dig. The soil came up dark, damp. No roots, no rocks, just an ease to the ground as if it knew how to open. In less than a minute, he had uncovered something. A stone, identical in shape and color to the others, but freshly unearthed. No moss, no aging. It bore no inscription. Isla took a step forward. He held up a hand to stop her. Then, just as calmly, he buried it again. When he stood, he handed her another slip of paper. Some graves bury themselves when they're not wanted. He turned and walked away, his boots leaving no impression in the dirt. She stood alone, listening to the wind. Somewhere in the trees beyond the field, something knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. She left before dusk. Back at the cottage, the stone on her doorstep was gone. But something had been left in its place. A single page, soaked at the corners, tucked under the doorframe. Not her handwriting, not her paper, but her sister's words. A diary entry Isla had torn out and burned the night Mara died. "The 13th one's mine. I told them the truth and now they won't let me forget. They say grief tastes best in silence." Rain began to fall in pulses. Not a drizzle, not a downpour, just sharp, isolated bursts, like something above was wringing the clouds dry by hand. Isla stood beneath the awning of the old rectory, trying not to shiver. The door in front of her was warped wood, stained black with time and salt. A brass plaque, barely legible beneath streaks of oxidation, read, "Jericho Hale, historian, formerly father." She knocked once. Then again. When the door finally opened, the man who stood behind it looked less like a priest and more like the last man you'd find in a confession booth. Tall, unshaven, and dressed in mismatched layers of tweed and denim. Jericho Hale's eyes held that same wind-burned intensity she'd seen in Kai. Only here, it was softened by something else. Fatigue, perhaps. Or knowing too much. "You're late," he said, not as an accusation, just as a fact. "I wasn't aware we had a time. You're here. That means something started." He stepped back without invitation. They always come in threes. The girl, the grave, and then the outsider. Isla hesitated on the threshold. "You're referring to me?" He said nothing, just disappeared into the dark interior. The inside of the rectory smelled like mildew and beeswax. Shelves sagged under, the weight of rotting books. A fireplace flickered low, casting everything in a fevered amber. Maps and sketches papered the walls, most of them focused on a small plot of cliffside land marked Field of Rest. Est. 1694. Tea? He asked, already pouring. No, thank you. I'd like to know what you meant. About the girl and the grave. Jericho turned, mug in hand, and stared at her over the rim. You've met her, then? Naomi Wren. Yes. She's not the first. You won't be the last. But she's younger than most. The young ones listen too well. To what? To the wrong voices. He handed her a folder, thick and water-damaged. These are burial records, he said. Official ones. From the parish, the county, and the old convent that used to own the land. 12 names, 12 dates, all carefully catalogued. She opened the folder. Names handwritten in looping script. Aldwych, Featherstone Wren, not Naomi, but another Wren, a Lillian, 1841. All deaths listed with the same peculiar note under cause, died before final words. They were all interred in Mourner's Field? Isla asked. Yes, Jericho said. The field was consecrated for them, the unshriven, people who died in the middle of confession or without last rites, a loophole between heaven and dirt. Then why? Isla stopped, hesitating. Why? Did Naomi say there was a 13th grave? Jericho turned toward the hearth, stirred the fire once, let the shadows shift. Because there was. He walked to the desk, pulled a drawer with a reluctant groan, returned with a photograph, sepia-toned, cracked at the edges, but clear enough. Black and white image of Mourner's Field sometime early last century. 12 graves arranged in a crescent, and just beyond them, barely in frame, a 13th stone, taller than the rest, marked with something Isla couldn't make out. She traced her finger over it. What happened to it? Covered, Jericho said. By who? No one knows. Some say the land itself. Others say the last mourner did it with his own hands. What was the name on it? There wasn't one, he said. There never is. But every generation, one person sees it, hears it. And then, well, he shrugged. They don't last long. Isla's mind moved backward, unspooling. The stone on her doorstep, her sister's name, the date etched into granite. Her voice coming through the floorboards like something being birthed from wood. I think Naomi believes her mother is under that grave, Isla said softly. Jericho didn't blink. Then Naomi's already been spoken to. A beat passed. Then another. What happens when the 13th grave speaks? Isla asked. Jericho leaned in, lowered his voice to something dry and crumbling. It doesn't speak, Doctor. Not really. He gestured to her chest. It remembers. Before she could respond, something cracked in the fire. Not wood, bone dry and hollow, like a rib splitting. The flames surged high, revealing one last object on the wall behind Jericho, a hand-drawn sigil, circular, thorned, marked at the center, with 13 tally marks, 12 crossed out, one still waiting. The fog thickened by the minute, curling between the gravestones like it was part of the soil, not the sky. Isla stood at the gate to Mourner's Field again, arms folded tight against her ribs. The cold had changed since her last visit. It was no longer just atmospheric. It had memory now, like it recognized her. Naomi Wren was already waiting near the center of the field, her coat buttoned up to the neck, the hem soaked in dew. She had something in her hands, small, dark, and glinting in the weak daylight. Isla approached cautiously, unsure of what kind of conversation the girl would allow today. Naomi's moods turned sharp without warning. Naomi, Isla said softly. The girl didn't look up, just stared at the ground, lips slightly parted, as if mouthing a silent name. What are you holding? Naomi opened her hand. A tooth. Small, yellowed, still flecked with blood at the root. Human. I pulled it this morning, she said. Isla knelt slowly, heart beginning to thump. Why? Because they asked. Naomi's voice was calm. It's part of the rite. What rite? Naomi tilted her head as if confused by the question. You really don't remember? She turned and began walking across the uneven field. Isla followed. The girl led her past the visible 12 stones to a place where the ground dipped slightly. It looked like nothing, just a bald patch of grass ringed by withered wildflowers. But Isla felt it before she saw it. A pull, a thinning. Naomi knelt, placed the tooth at the center of the patch. Then she cupped her hands around her mouth and whispered something into the dirt. A moment later, the ground shifted. Not much. Not enough to be definite. Just a faint settling sound like something shifting its weight underground. Naomi turned back to Isla. Her face was blank, but her eyes were wet with a single perfect tear. They can hear better in the fog, she said. Naomi, who is they? The ones who couldn't finish their story. Isla crouched beside her, studying the patch of dirt. Her breath came out shaky, visible in the air. Do you believe your mother is under there? She was, but not anymore. That answer chilled her more than anything else. I think they let her go, Naomi continued, when they found someone new. Isla didn't speak. Naomi looked directly at her now, eyes clear and still. You've got a stone already, don't you? One with your name on it. Isla swallowed hard. Naomi smiled faintly. They only give those when it's close. The sky above them dimmed, though the sun hadn't moved. Isla's ears popped, pressure dropping like a sudden descent in altitude. Somewhere beyond the field, the trees creaked in unison. Do you know why they chose this place? Naomi asked. Isla shook her head. Naomi picked up a twig and began drawing in the soil. A circle, a line through it, then a spiral. They say this cliff was the first place a confession was swallowed whole. A woman came here 100 years ago to tell the truth about something terrible she did to her brother. But the priest never arrived. She died here. She choked on her own tongue, trying to get the words out. And the earth took her. Naomi stood, brushing her hands off. She's the first mourner. She's the one who teaches the others how to remember. The others, all the ones who died before they were done telling the truth. They don't want forgiveness. Naomi looked at Isla with something almost like pity. They want to finish the sentence. Behind them, the patch of dirt shifted again. A small depression formed in the center. Not dug, not pressed, just fallen in. Isla grabbed Naomi's hand and pulled her back, but the girl didn't resist. You shouldn't fight it, she whispered. It only makes the voice come out wrong. Isla stared at the hollow in the earth. Something was whispering, too quiet to make out, but it spoke in her voice, her exact tone, rhythm, breath, repeating one word over and over. Mara, Mara, Mara. Isla staggered. Back. Naomi remained where she was, watching her with calm detachment. You didn't answer the call, she said. I was 23, Isla said, more to herself. I didn't know she died alone, Naomi interrupted. So now she's not. That's when Isla saw it, just beside Naomi's foot, half hidden in the roots of a nearby yew tree. Another stone, not new, not freshly unearthed. No, this one was cracked, blackened, almost entirely sunken into the earth. But it bore the outline of a name that was unmistakably hers. Dr. I. Trenholm. The bottom line had not yet been carved. Naomi placed the tooth gently on top of it. Then she turned and walked away, and the earth whispered once more in Mara's voice. You remember now? The sea returned after midnight. Not visually, there was no moonlight to cast it, but Isla could hear it now, the thick, slapping churn of waves against the cliffside below the cottage. The drag and pull of something massive and unkind shifting beneath the water. It sounded closer than it should have, closer than she remembered. She hadn't spoken a word since returning from the field. Naomi's last glance, so calm, so pitying, lingered behind Isla's eyes like an afterimage. She locked every door in the cottage, drew the curtains tight, pulled the quilt over her knees, and sat in bed holding the voice recorder she usually used for patient notes. But tonight, she pressed record without speaking, let the silence spool out for 10 full minutes. Then, faintly, first like a breath, then clearer, a sound emerged. It wasn't the sea. It was crying, soft, rhythmic, muffled, from beneath the floor. Isla's breath caught. She leaned forward, pressed her ear to the plank floorboards, cold, dusty. The sobbing was unmistakable now, childlike, isolated, but not helpless. It had a pattern. Isla sat up, reached for her phone to check the time. 3:13 a.m. She slid out of bed, grabbed her torch, and stepped lightly down the hall. The floor groaned in long sighs beneath her weight. The crying didn't stop. If anything, it welcomed her now, grew louder the closer she got to the sitting room. There was a trap door in the corner near the hearth, old rusted hinges, a leather loop nailed into the wood. She hesitated only once, then opened it. Below was a crawl space, 2 feet of clearance, damp with seawater smell. No light, just dark soil and the faint outline of old bricks lining one wall. And in the far corner, nestled in the mud, a coffin, not full-sized, child-sized, made of wood gone soft with moisture. It pulsed slightly, like it had been breathing. Isla dropped to her knees, crawled forward, each movement loud in the stillness. When she reached it, she placed her hand on the top, warm, slick. She pulled back. Inside the crawl space, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Then a voice. Not loud, not sudden, just present, familiar. "Mara?" Isla said before she could stop herself. The voice answered, but not in English, not at first. It came in a low murmur, scraped syllables, something between a prayer and a confession. Then, "You left the phone ringing." Isla flinched. "No one knew," the voice continued, "but you did." She backed out of the crawl space, palms streaked with mud, heart hammering. The trapdoor slammed shut on its own. Isla sat in the middle of the room, not moving, not breathing. Then she saw it, on the mantel, an old Polaroid, one that hadn't been there yesterday, a picture of Mara, age 10, smiling faintly beneath a twisted tree. Standing next to her, face in shadow, lips sewn shut, was Kai Fielder, younger but unmistakable. On the back of the photo, in a child's handwriting, she listened. "Once you didn't." Morning came with no sunrise, just a deeper shade of grey and the faint sour scent of sea rot curling through the open chimney. Isla hadn't slept. She sat hunched in the kitchen with the Polaroid clutched in her palm, staring at the stitched lips of the man standing beside her 10-year-old sister. Her mind reeled. Mara had never mentioned knowing anyone from Nettlewick, never spoken of the cliffs, never mentioned that field. But now patterns were emerging in the silence, and silence had teeth. She dressed and left the cottage without eating. Driven by the kind of fear that didn't run or scream, it searched. The kind that needed to know if the thing under your bed had moved since last night. Mourner's Field was not empty. At least 8 people stood among the graves. Silent, hooded. Not a crowd, just scattered shapes, some kneeling, some still as statues. Locals, all older. Most carried something in their hands. A pale woman in a shawl laid down a broken locket. A boy, maybe 15, placed a taxidermy bird, wings splayed, eyes gone. A man with milky cataracts reached into his pocket and left behind a single torn page from a hymnal. Each one placed their offering on the 12th grave. Always the 12th. Never another. Then they left one by one without ever looking up. The last to go was the woman in the shawl. As she passed Isla on the path, she murmured without stopping, "Let it feed. Don't name it." Isla stepped into the field. The 12th grave was marked by a stone flatter than the others, scalloped by wind, half swallowed by earth. She knelt beside it. The offerings lay arranged with unnatural care, not haphazard, curated. Something about the placement, the space between each item, the angle of the locket's chain. It felt ritualistic, not in the modern sense, in the way animals build nests, the way wounds scar in spirals. Her gaze fell to the hymnal page. She picked it up. It wasn't a hymn, it was a confession. The handwriting was frantic, some letters missing, smudged, but legible. I heard her voice inside the stove. My wife. Dead 10 years. She said our child wasn't ours, that I made the wrong choice. That she never forgave me. I told the truth to the grave. I gave it the tooth, the bird, the photo. Now the voice comes less often, but sometimes. I see her behind glass. Isla dropped the page. Her mouth felt dry. To the side of the 12th grave, the ground shimmered, faintly, not visibly, not light, just an impression in the mind, a sense that something was watching, listening. She stepped backward. Then it happened. Her foot struck something soft. She turned. A leather pouch, half buried in the moss, slumped open. Inside, feathers, teeth, a lock of blonde hair tied with red thread, and beneath it at the bottom, a photograph, recent, color, glossy, a still frame from a traffic camera. Isla, in her car, mouth mid-speech, eyes turned toward the passenger seat. No one was in the car with her that day. She was sure of it, but the image said otherwise. The passenger seat held a shape, blurry, slight, head bowed, Mara, wearing the same expression she had in the old Polaroid, almost smiling, almost. Isla stared at it for what felt like hours, until a low voice behind her broke the spell. "Don't stay here long." She turned. Kai stood at the edge of the field, the morning fog gathering around his boots like a servant. He held out another page from his notepad. Every offering feeds it, but some memories are too strong. They call it back. Isla stepped toward him. "What is it feeding on?" Kai shook his head, wrote again. Not what, who. He lifted his coat briefly. Showed the long line of stitches running up his ribcage. A handprint, faint and bruised, was pressed around his sternum like someone had tried to reach through. Isla reeled. She tried to speak, to question, but her throat locked. Kai held up one final note before he vanished into the trees. "You'll offer something too. Before the 13th day, everyone does." As he disappeared, Isla felt the wind shift again. Behind her, the 12th grave gave off a long, slow exhale, and from under the stone, a whisper rose, this time not Mara. This time herself, repeating her own words from the day of Mara's funeral. "We were never close. She always made things dramatic. It's not my fault she didn't call again." But now they sounded wrong, like lies spoken through borrowed lungs. The offerings hadn't silenced the voices, they'd only made them smarter. Morning came with no sunrise, just a deeper shade of grey and the faint, sour scent of sea rot curling through the open chimney. Isla hadn't slept. She sat hunched in the kitchen with the Polaroid clutched in her palm, staring at the stitched lips of the man standing beside her 10-year-old sister. Her mind reeled. Mara had never mentioned knowing anyone from Nettlewick, never spoken of the cliffs, never mentioned that field. But now patterns were emerging in the silence, and silence had teeth. She dressed and left the cottage without eating, driven by the kind of fear that didn't run or scream, it searched. the kind that needed to know if the thing under your bed had moved since last night. Mourners' Field was not empty. At least 8 people stood among the graves. Silent, hooded. Not a crowd, just scattered shapes, some kneeling, some still as statues. Locals, all older. Most carried something in their hands. A pale woman in a shawl laid down a broken locket. A boy, maybe 15, placed a taxidermy bird. Wings splayed, eyes gone. A man with milky cataracts reached into his pocket and left behind a single torn page from a hymnal. Each one placed their offering on the 12th grave, always the 12th. Never another. Then they left one by one without ever looking up. The last to go was the woman in the shawl. As she passed Isla on the path, she murmured without stopping, "Let it feed, don't name it." Isla stepped into the field. The 12th grave was marked by a stone flatter than the others, scalloped by wind, half swallowed by earth. She knelt beside it. The offerings lay arranged with unnatural care, not haphazard, curated. Something about the placement, the space between each item, the angle of the locket's chain. It felt ritualistic, not in the modern sense, in the way animals build nests, the way wounds scar in spirals. Her gaze fell to the hymnal page. She picked it up. It wasn't a hymn, it was a confession. The handwriting was frantic, some letters missing, smudged, but legible. I heard her voice inside the stove. My wife. Dead 10 years. She said our child wasn't ours, that I made the wrong choice. That she never forgave me. I told the truth to the grave. I gave it the tooth, the bird, the photo. Now the voice comes less often, but sometimes I see her behind glass. Isla dropped the page. Her mouth felt dry. To the side of the 12th grave, the ground shimmered, faintly, not visibly, not light, just an impression in the mind. A sense that something was watching, listening. She stepped backward. Then it happened. Her foot struck something soft. She turned. A leather pouch, half buried in the moss, slumped open. Inside, feathers, teeth, a lock of blonde hair tied with red thread, and beneath it at the bottom, a photograph, recent, color, glossy, a still frame from a traffic camera. Isla, in her car, mouth mid-speech, eyes turned toward the passenger seat. No one was in the car with her that day. She was sure of it, but the image said otherwise. The passenger seat held a shape. Blurry, slight, head bowed, Mara, wearing the same expression she had in the old Polaroid, almost smiling, almost. Isla stared at it for what felt like hours, until a low voice behind her broke the spell. "Don't stay here long." She turned. Kai stood at the edge of the field, the morning fog gathering around his boots like a servant. He held out another page from his notepad. Every offering feeds it, but some memories are too strong. They call it back. Isla stepped toward him. "What is it feeding on?" Kai shook his head, wrote again. Not what, who. He lifted his coat briefly. Showed the long line of stitches running up his rib cage. A handprint, faint and bruised, was pressed around his sternum like someone had tried to reach through. Isla reeled. She tried to speak, to question, but her throat locked. Kai held up one final note before he vanished into the trees. "You'll offer something too. Before the 13th day, everyone does." As he disappeared, Isla felt the wind shift again. Behind her, the 12th grave gave off a long, slow exhale, and from under the stone, a whisper rose, this time not Mara. This time herself, repeating her own words from the day of Mara's funeral. "We were never close. She always made things dramatic. It's not my fault she didn't call again. But now they sounded wrong, like lies spoken through borrowed lungs. The offerings hadn't silenced the voices, they'd only made them smarter." The day after Naomi's disappearance, the fog pressed tighter into Nettlewick, smothering the town under a blanket of damp silence. It felt like the entire world had gone still, like all things that mattered had been swallowed whole. No one was speaking. No one was moving. The wind hadn't blown in days, and the sea, once so tempestuous, now only licked the cliffs in ghostly sighs. Isla felt the pressure in her chest, the weight of something coming. And it was something older than grief. It was the knowledge that the ground beneath her was shifting, that there were voices rising from places they shouldn't, that Naomi was lost somewhere in the fog, and the earth was answering. She had to find Jericho Hale. Father Jericho had been her last source of stability in all this madness. He'd given her a glimpse of history, of law, of the ritualistic patterns that governed this land, patterns that seemed to extend far beyond anything she could explain. But there was something more to him, something he had held back, something he wasn't telling her, something about the land and the way it fed on secrets. She found him at his makeshift desk in the old rectory, scribbling furiously into a leather-bound journal. His back was to the door, but he must have sensed her arrival because he didn't startle when she entered. Instead, he set the pen down and turned to face her, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken. Isla. His voice was raw, as though he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "Did you hear it?" She nodded, her mouth dry. "The voices, the earth calling." She swallowed. "Naomi, she's still out there, and something's waking in the ground." Jericho's hands trembled as he reached for a cup of tea on the desk. He didn't speak for a long moment, just stared into the dark liquid. When he finally raised his gaze, his eyes seemed impossibly tired. "You're too close," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm not leaving her out there." "I can't," Isla replied, her voice breaking. "Tell me what's happening, Jericho. Tell me what I need to know." He sighed deeply, his breath coming out in a heavy gust. "It's the land, Isla. The land has always taken something." He turned toward the wall, where maps and ancient texts were pinned like a twisted roadmap to oblivion. Mourner's Field, this place, it has patterns. Patterns that pull people into them. Patterns? Isla echoed, confusion flickering in her chest. "The 13th grave," Jericho said, nodding toward the wall. "The one that moves. It doesn't move because it's not real. It's not the grave that shifts. It's the earth that shifts around it. The ground here, it swallows the past. The dead, they don't die right. They stay hungry." Isla's heart skipped a beat. "What does that mean? Hungry for what?" He looked at her, and for the first time since their meeting, his eyes seemed clear, as though he were seeing the truth of it all for the first time. "It wants to remember," he said almost reverently. "The dead here don't rest. They wait. They try to finish the story they were denied. And if it doesn't end, the land will take another." Isla felt the cold creep down her spine. The ground beneath her feet seemed to grow heavy, as if her very presence was starting to weigh too much. "Naomi," she whispered. "Naomi is the one it's after, isn't it? She's the one who's going to finish the story. I have to stop her from being the next one." Jericho didn't reply. Instead, he turned back to the wall and began to rummage through a drawer. After a moment, he produced a thick, faded book. A text Isla hadn't seen before. Its leather cover was cracked and brittle, but the pages inside were pristine, marked with symbols that felt older than the town itself. "This," Jericho said, holding the book out to her, "is everything." He began to flip through the pages, muttering under his breath, until his finger landed on a page that seemed to radiate with a cold, sickening energy. Isla leaned in to read. The words were written in a language she didn't recognize, but there was a picture beside the text, a grave, dark and looming, its stone covered in vines. The 13th stone. But this time, something was etched in the earth. No, in the air around the stone. Something that wasn't visible at first, but upon closer inspection, shifted. The 13th grave, Jericho whispered, his voice trembling. Now. It moves in a way that makes it hard to track. It's not about the stone. It's about what rises around it. The truth buried deep. Something dangerous. Isla looked at him, feeling her heartbeat quicken. What happens if someone touches it? What happens if Naomi gets too close? Jericho's eyes flickered. The earth will pull her in, not as a body, not as a soul, as a voice. He leaned closer to her, his face pale, his lips barely moving. The earth is greedy. It feeds on confession. It feeds on lies. The dead are never buried properly. They never finish. Her eyes widened. You're saying, Naomi, she'll become one of them. She'll never leave, Jericho said. But there's more. Isla stepped back. More? He held out his hand, gripping her wrist, pulling her toward the window where the fog was beginning to thin. Tomorrow it'll come for you too, he said. You've been in its reach, and you'll never be the same. Isla tried to pull her hand away, but his grip tightened, his fingers digging into her skin, and that's when the scream tore through the silence, from deep within the earth. The scream rattled through the walls of the rectory. It was high-pitched, frantic, a voice born of pure terror. The sound seemed to distort the very air around Isla, warping her senses, making the world feel wrong. Her breath caught in her throat, panic tightening her chest. Jericho's grip on her wrist was still firm, but it wasn't the urgency in his hands that made her skin crawl. It was the way he seemed unmoved. His eyes didn't widen in fear. They didn't even flicker. He only stared at the door, waiting. Isla's heart thundered in her chest. That was Naomi, she gasped. Jericho didn't reply, but his jaw tightened. His gaze remained fixed on the door, as if expecting something more to come. He slowly let go of her wrist, stepping back as if the scream didn't belong to anyone he cared about. It's too late, he said quietly. It's already started. The earth is shifting. Shifting? What does that mean? Isla asked, her voice shaking. Jericho took a slow, deliberate breath. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled open the drawer to his desk and retrieved a crude map. It was old, crinkled and faded with age, and the lines were uneven, hastily drawn. But there was something about it that made Isla's throat close. It was a map of Mourner's Field, the graveyard. But something was off. The drawing didn't show just 12 graves. It showed an open space, a hole that wasn't there before. It was a 13th spot marked in black ink, but this one had no name. It was simply labeled The Hollow. The Hollow? Isla repeated, leaning over the map. What does that mean? It's where the land eats itself, Jericho replied. His voice was heavy, like he was speaking from a place of long-lost understanding. When the ground begins to remember, it pulls in more than it can handle. The 13th grave. It's not just a plot. It's a passage, a space that shifts between the living and the dead. His finger traced the map slowly, the path leading to the center of Mourner's Field, where a large, jagged crack marred the earth. Every time the earth tries to finish a story, it needs more to feed it, more voices, more truths. His finger stopped at the hollow, where the line cut deep into the center. Naomi's voice is already a part of it. You will be too, if you don't stop it. Isla's heart sank. You're telling me that Naomi, she's going to be pulled into this thing. Jericho didn't look at her when he nodded. She's already there, Isla. You can't stop the shift, but you can change it. You have to find the 13th stone, the one that moves. It's the anchor. The land is tied to it. And the only way to undo it is to face the truth that's buried there. Isla felt the weight of the room close in on her. The air felt thicker now, heavier with the knowledge she wasn't ready to confront. Jericho's words had a cold edge to them, like they weren't just warnings. They were facts. Naomi's disappearance wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was a necessity, a sacrifice. She was becoming part of the land's hunger, its endless loop of unfinished stories. No, Isla breathed, shaking her head. I can't lose her. I can't. You're already. Too late, Jericho interrupted softly, his voice devoid of sympathy. She's already begun to shift. The scream from outside, the one that had driven Isla to Jericho's door, came again. Only this time it wasn't just a scream. It was a chant. Low, guttural, and unmistakably Naomi's voice. The words reverberated through the walls, rising from the ground itself. It wasn't a call for help. It was a summoning. Naomi, Isla whispered. No. Without thinking, she turned and ran toward the door. She couldn't think about what Jericho had said. She couldn't focus on the hollow or the 13th grave. She had to find her sister. The fog outside had thickened further, the mist now swirling in unnatural patterns, almost like it was beckoning her. Her pulse raced, but every step toward the door felt like a step further into something that wanted her. Isla, wait. Jericho called, but she ignored him. She rushed out into the mist, the world dimming around her. The air was so heavy that her chest ached with each breath. The fog seemed to respond to her movements, thickening as if it were alive, responding to her fear. The cemetery was shrouded now. The 12 graves, which once seemed like the foundation of this place, were blurred, their outlines indistinct. And standing at the center, the empty space, the hollow, yawned before her, the earth, around it trembling faintly. A crack appeared in the ground, jagged and deep. The land seemed to be pulling inward, swallowing itself, and the 13th grave was nowhere to be seen, except for the blackened outline that now burned through the fog, as if the earth had opened a wound. Her footsteps slowed as she approached the center. The ground beneath her felt unstable, as though something massive and ancient was stirring just below the surface. And then, a figure appeared at the edge of the field, barely visible, standing still in the fog. It was Naomi. She stood at the foot of the 13th grave, her head tilted back, mouth open, eyes dark and empty. Naomi! Isla screamed, her voice cracking, but Naomi didn't respond. She stood there, motionless, chanting the same words over and over. Isla's blood ran cold as she heard the words clearly for the first time. I am the truth. I am the story. I am the voice that never dies. The earth shook, the hollow deepened, and, from the center of the grave, a shadow stretched out toward Isla. Something that was not entirely Naomi, not entirely human. The fog swallowed Isla whole as she stepped toward Naomi, her heart hammering against her ribs. The earth groaned beneath her, a deep rhythmic pulse that seemed to be in sync with the chant coming from her sister's lips. It was as though the very land was breathing, waiting for something to happen, waiting for her to make something happen. Isla's feet felt heavy in the shifting soil, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let her move forward. The hollow yawned in front of her, a black wound in the ground growing wider with every passing second. From it, a cold wind surged upward, tugging at her hair and clothes. Her body wanted to recoil, but her mind, the sharp, logical part of her that had always taken control, urged her on. Naomi's voice, once soft and childlike, was now a low, guttural murmur. Her eyes were empty, black hollows staring into nothingness, and her mouth moved in a grotesque rhythm, the words tumbling out like an incantation. "Naomi," Isla cried, her voice shaking. "Please, stop! It's not you. This is the land. It's taking you." But Naomi didn't acknowledge her. She continued to chant, her words melding with the land, her voice merging with the earth itself. It was no longer a human sound. It was something older, something primordial. As Isla stepped closer, the earth beneath her feet trembled again, and a violent crack split the air. A jagged fissure shot from the hollow, a line of blackness that stretched deep into the earth. From that crack, a black, oily substance began to rise, a liquid that gleamed like oil, but smelled like decay. It bubbled and churned as though it were alive, and it flowed toward the edge of the hollow, reaching out toward Naomi's feet. Isla couldn't move. The air felt thick with dread, and the world seemed to slow. Her mind screamed for her to turn, back, to run, to do anything other than stand here, watching as her sister stood at the edge of the abyss, calling the land to feast on her very soul. "Naomi," Isla shouted again, her voice raw with desperation. "You have to come back. You can't stay here." But Naomi's chanting only grew louder, more frantic. And then, just as Isla's legs finally moved, just as she reached out to grab her sister, the ground shifted beneath them both. The earth cracked open, wide and deep, and Naomi's body seemed to dissolve into the fog, vanishing before Isla could touch her. A scream tore through Isla's throat as she fell to her knees, reaching out for Naomi, grasping at nothing, and then the hollow shifted again. A shadow, blacker than the night itself, began to rise from the crack in the earth. It loomed over Isla like a creature born of nightmare, twisting and changing shape with each passing second. It was not a figure. It was a presence, a consuming, all-encompassing void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. For the first time, Isla felt something other than fear. She felt the weight of the land pressing down on her, squeezing the life from her chest. The hollow wasn't just an open wound in the earth, it was an anchor. And whatever had been pulled into it, the voices, the memories, the spirits, was beginning to spill forth, rising from the very ground itself. Isla staggered to her feet, her body trembling, but she didn't back away. She couldn't. This was her last chance to save Naomi, to save herself, to stop whatever was pulling them into the ground. The shadow continued to twist, its form undulating as if it were made of dark smoke, a thing that could never fully take shape, but only consume. It rose higher, and within it, Isla saw faces, whispering. Faces, eyes wide with fear, mouths agape in silent screams. The shadow spoke then, not with a voice, but with all voices, a chorus that echoed inside her skull. It was everything, 1,000 whispers, 1,000,000 murmurs, all desperate, all craving something more. "You took too long," the voice of the land said, its tone cold and jagged. "The truth is buried, but it will rise, and when it does, it will take the one who speaks the loudest." Isla's vision blurred, but she couldn't look away. "What are you?" she breathed, her voice small and helpless against the sheer force of what was before her. "I am the one that remembers," the voice replied, its presence pressing down on her chest like the weight of mountains. "I am the truth, the voice that was never allowed to speak. And now you will join us." The shadow expanded, reaching toward Isla with tendrils that seemed to writhe and coil, pulling at the very air around her. She stumbled backward, but there was no place to escape. There was no escape from the hollow. She could feel it closing in, tightening around her, but something deep within her fought back. "No," Isla said, her voice suddenly sharp with defiance. "You won't take me. You won't take Naomi." The land groaned. The shadow writhed. Isla took one step forward, her hands shaking as she reached for the earth. Her fingers sank into the soil, deeper than she ever thought possible. Beneath her hand, something cold and solid met her touch. She pulled, yanked with all her strength, and with a sickening groan, something shifted. A stone, a piece of earth. The 13th grave was moving. The stone, half buried and cracked, was rising from the depths of the hollow. Isla knew then that the land had always been waiting for this moment, the moment when someone would come to finish the story, and now she was the one who would do it. The 13th stone, jagged and blackened, rose from the earth with a groan that seemed to shake the very bones of the land. Isla's fingers trembled as she clung to it, trying to steady herself against the dark pulse that surged through the ground beneath her. The air thickened, each breath harder to take, each second dragging her further into the suffocating weight of the hollow. The stone was cool to the touch, but it felt alive in a way that made the hair on the back of her neck stand at attention, as if it had a memory, as if it had been waiting for her. With the stone in her hand, the world around her seemed to freeze. The shadows that had risen from the hollow recoiled, as if pushed back by the force of the grave, but the land itself watched, silent, hungry. Finish it. The voice came from everywhere, curling around her like smoke, and for the first time, Isla understood it wasn't speaking to her. It wasn't calling her to complete something she hadn't started. It was forcing her to do what had already been done. The truth was buried here, and Isla had always known it. The land knew it. Naomi knew it. The stone in her hand pulsed with energy, and then Isla saw it, a vision flashing in front of her eyes. A memory that wasn't hers, a memory of another voice, her own, or something that had once been her own. A child's voice, a whispered confession. I didn't save her. The words hung in the air, jagged and full of regret. The air itself seemed to bend around them, tightening, closing in. The fog swirled around Isla, and the very earth beneath her feet trembled, as though it could no longer bear the weight of the truth. The land didn't want her to just understand. It wanted her to accept. Her sister's face flashed in the darkness, Mara, standing at the edge of the field, staring at Isla with eyes that were no longer filled with warmth. Her mouth moved. You should have answered the phone. The words hung in the air like a curse, jagged and sharp. No, Isla whispered, shaking her head violently, but the vision didn't fade. It only grew clearer. The ground beneath her feet cracked and shifted, and the shadows around her pressed in tighter. There was no escape from the truth. You didn't answer, the voice repeated, more insistent this time. You left her there. Isla fell to her knees, the weight of it crashing down on her. It wasn't just the land that had been waiting for her to finish the story. It was the part of herself that she had buried all these years, the part of her that couldn't face her sister's death, the part that had buried the guilt deep inside, never willing to look at it, never willing to understand. But now, with the land whispering in her ear, there was no more hiding. She reached out, placing her palm on the stone. The earth rumbled again, and this time, it wasn't just the soil beneath her that shook. The very air seemed to shudder with it. Suddenly, the ground beneath Isla split open, and she was falling, plummeting into darkness, into the hollow. The wind howled in her ears, and the stone fell from her hand. But something else followed her. A weight, something shifting, moving, breathing. Her breath caught as she landed hard on the damp earth below. She opened her eyes, blinking against the blackness, and then she saw it. The shape was moving toward her. No, not moving, crawling. A figure, hunched and twisted, with limbs too long, fingers bent at odd angles. Its face was hidden by matted hair, but Isla could see the gleam of bone beneath the pale skin. Its mouth was wide open, the jaw stretched unnaturally wide. And from it the air filled with a sharp, guttural sound, the kind of sound that came from a throat that had been cut open. The figure reached out with one hand, and the ground beneath. Isla shifted again. The hollow was alive. It was growing. It was feeding. "No!" Isla gasped, pushing herself back. Her fingers scraped at the cold, wet earth as she tried to scramble away. But it was no use. The shape was upon her now, its fingers wrapping around her wrist with an unnatural strength, pulling her closer. The air around her crackled with the presence of something older, something dark. Then she understood. The hollow didn't just consume. It didn't just remember. It wanted to speak. The voice from the shape was clear now, crawling up from the depths of the earth, dragging itself through her chest, twisting her insides as it surged forward. Finish. The confession. Isla's heart thundered in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The ground beneath her feet was cold and wet, pressing in from every side, and her lungs burned with the weight of the truth she had buried. The face of her sister, the woman she couldn't save, flashed in front of her eyes. She had buried the memory, buried the guilt, buried it all, because she couldn't bear the weight of what happened. But the land wouldn't let her. The voice swelled, louder now, deeper, an impossible thing reaching up through her throat. Her stomach clenched as she felt it. The stone, the 13th grave, all of it, the words she had never said to Mara, the truth she had never told. "I'm sorry." The words escaped her lips, barely a whisper, but it was enough. The ground shuddered again. The hollow rumbled, the blackness pulling back. And then, silence. A silence that felt final. The earth was still. The hollow was empty. But the stone, still, lodged in the earth, began to move. It sank deeper into the soil, and with it, the land's hunger began to ease. And with that ease, a single, soft voice echoed through the air, like the last breath of a soul that had waited too long. "Thank you." Isla sank to the ground, shaking. Her mind was lost in the weight of it all, the finality of her sister's death, the truth she'd never been able to face. The hollow had claimed its toll, but in the process, it had given something back, and Isla could finally breathe. The earth was still. The hollow, once a yawning chasm of darkness and hunger, now lay quiet. The shadows that had crawled from its depths, the murmurs that had twisted through the air, were gone. The ground itself seemed to exhale, as though something, some deep, oppressive weight, had been lifted. But the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was a suspended silence, thick and suffocating, as though the land itself was waiting for something, watching for something that Isla couldn't quite name. She knelt there in the heart of Mourner's Field, beneath the fog that had never lifted. Her fingers were covered in the cold, damp earth, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs were numb, her hands trembling violently. Her chest heaved with slow, uneven breaths, each one heavier than the last. Her body felt like a shell, fragile and hollow. Her mind, clouded by the events, clung to the fragments of what had just transpired. Naomi, her sister, was still there, somewhere. Isla could feel it, like the memory of her was embedded in the earth itself. But the hollow place, the hunger that had taken her voice, had been satisfied. She thought of the final words the land had given her, the gratitude, the closure. But had it really been closure? Or just another part of the cycle? The part that ended with one voice silenced, only to open the door for another. The fog parted momentarily, and for a brief second, the pale light of dawn pierced through the thick cloud cover. The world seemed to stir with the shift, as though time itself had caught up with them. As though everything that had happened here, the land, the hunger, the voices, had finally ceased. Isla's eyes darted toward the edge of the field. There, just past the graves, a faint figure stood in the mist. She blinked, sure she was imagining it, but when her eyes refocused, she could see the outline clearly. A shadow, a silhouette, but this time, it wasn't Naomi. It was a woman, taller than Naomi, her face obscured by the same kind of mist that had coated the field since Isla had arrived. But something about her presence felt known. Something about the way she stood there, distant but certain, made Isla's heart skip a beat. "Mara," Isla whispered, barely able to form the words. The woman did not answer at first. She just stood, staring at Isla with an intensity that made Isla feel small, insignificant, like she was just another part of this place, another fragment in a long history of buried truths. "Mara," Isla said again, this time louder, her voice cracking. "Please." The figure didn't move. And then, just when Isla thought she could no longer bear the weight of the silence, the woman took a step forward. With a sharp, shuddering breath, Isla took a tentative step toward her sister, her hand reaching out into the fog, into the shifting space between them. She wasn't sure if she was seeing clearly, whether Mara was truly there, or if the land itself was playing tricks on her mind, forcing her to relive the last moments of her sister's life. But something about the figure was real. It was more than just a shadow. It was a presence. The woman's face was still hidden by the mist, but as she moved closer, the fog seemed to curl away, revealing the soft, familiar lines of her features. Isla's breath caught in her throat. "Mara, is it really you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The woman's lips parted, but she did not speak. Instead, her hands reached up, slowly, deliberately, and lifted her face to the light. For a moment, Isla froze, her eyes locked on her sister's. Her heart raced and a cold sweat broke out along her skin. There was no mistaking it. The woman standing before her was Mara, but something was wrong. Her eyes, once so full of warmth and kindness, were now cold, empty. Her smile, the same faint one she used to give when she was young, now seemed twisted, strained. She stepped closer, her movements fluid, unnatural. Isla's chest tightened as the air grew colder, the space between them charged with something she couldn't name. The fog around them thickened again, swirling in on itself, as though the earth had begun to stir once more. "Mara, what's happening?" Isla asked, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. She knew what this was. Mara's lips barely moved when she finally spoke. Her voice wasn't the soft, familiar one that Isla had always known. It was distorted, as though someone else had taken the shape of her voice, someone who had been waiting too long, someone who had unfinished business. "You left me," Mara whispered, her voice echoing in Isla's ears. But it wasn't just her voice, it was the land's. "You left me here alone. I waited for you. I called for you." Isla stepped back, her breath ragged. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but her feet felt glued to the earth. The mist thickened again, closing in on her. "Mara, please," Isla gasped, her mind spinning. I didn't know. I didn't know how to fix it." The figure reached out a hand, slow and deliberate, until it was within inches of Isla's face. Her fingers were cold, impossibly cold, as they brushed against Isla's cheek. "You could have saved me." Mara's voice coiled around her. "You could have answered. You could have listened." Isla closed her eyes, her heart breaking as she finally understood. It wasn't just the land that had been waiting for the truth. It was her too. She had never been able to forgive herself. Not for the years spent avoiding the truth. Not for the voicemail she had never returned. Not for the sister she had left behind. And now, standing here, with the land still trembling beneath her feet, Isla realized what the hollow had been after. What it had needed. Forgiveness. but not just Mara's. Isla opened her eyes, her voice trembling as she spoke the words she had been running from for so long. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have been there for you. The figure before her did not move. It did not smile. It only stood, waiting. And in the final moment, the fog parted fully, and Mara's image vanished into the mist. Isla's breath caught as the weight of the silence took over, deep, suffocating, but not quite empty. The earth fell still. The hollow was no longer hungry, and somewhere, far in the distance, she heard the faintest whisper of a voice. "It's enough now." Isla stood there for a long time, her hands shaking at her sides. The fog began to lift, the first rays of dawn filtering through the veil. The land, at last, was silent. Isla had faced the truth, and with it something had finally been let go, and that was all she needed. Still here? Brave. Or maybe you just like the feeling of being watched. Like, subscribe, and drop your time and location in the comments, so we know who's still out there. Now breathe slow. The worst is coming. Story 2. Ilara's breath caught in her chest as the bus rumbled over the uneven dirt road, each jolt sending a pang of discomfort through her bones. She pressed her face against the cool glass of the window, the mist of her breath fogging up the view, and gazed out at the dense forest surrounding the small town. The landscape was eerily familiar. The towering pines, the winding path leading to her childhood home, the sky painted in dusky hues of evening light. It all felt like a memory, like she was stepping back in time. The forest seemed endless, a dark and impenetrable stretch of green that swallowed the horizon. It was a place that had always felt alive, as though the trees themselves whispered secrets to each other, guarding the boundaries of the house that lay deep within. She had not been back here in years, not since her father had disappeared. Her eyes flitted nervously to the worn sign by the side of the road that read Caldwell Ridge, the name of the remote town where she had grown up, now reduced to a few rundown buildings and forgotten landmarks. The bus slowed, creaking to a halt at a small stop near the edge of the woods. Ilara could already make out the narrow dirt path that led to the house, the one she'd walked countless times as a child, the one that now seemed to stretch endlessly toward a place she didn't want to return to. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her bag, the familiar weight of it a comfort in her lap. She had no choice but to return. Her mother's health had been deteriorating for months, and with no one else to care for her, Ilara had no choice but to come back. Her mother, who had never quite been the same after her father's disappearance, had been growing weaker with each passing week. The calls from the small town's doctor had become more frequent, urgent. Ilara had tried to ignore them, had tried to tell herself that she could stay away, but in the end, blood had called her back. The door of the bus squeaked as she pushed it open and stepped out onto the gravel. The evening air was cool, the scent of pine and damp earth filling her lungs. She swallowed hard, her throat tight with unspoken emotions. As her feet sank into the soft earth, she glanced back at the bus, which had already begun to pull away. Her stomach twisted. She was alone now, completely alone. The town had long since faded into the distance, and the house loomed ahead, silent, forgotten, as though it were a relic from another life. Her mother's voice, a thin whisper through the years, echoed in her mind. "Come home, Ilara." She had tried to ignore it, to silence that voice. But here she was, standing at the threshold of the life she had left behind, staring at the house that had once held warmth and love, but now seemed cold, vacant, as though it had swallowed everything good that had ever been. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she made her way down the path, her heart pounding in her chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth beneath her was trying to hold her back, to stop her from continuing. But she couldn't turn back now. She had to see her mother. She had to face whatever had happened to her father, whatever had caused him to vanish without a trace all those years ago. As she neared the house, she noticed how different it looked. Once it had been a charming two-story cottage with white wooden walls, its green shutters painted to match the vibrant forest outside. But now the white paint had chipped and peeled, leaving the wood beneath exposed to the elements. The roof sagged in places, its edges overrun by creeping ivy that had long since taken over the structure. The windows, once sparkling with life, now stood dark and hollow. The front door, a heavy oak thing, was slightly ajar, swinging ever so gently in the wind. The house seemed to be waiting for her. Ilara stopped just in front of the porch, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She looked up at the windows, her heart racing. There was no movement, no sign of life. Her mother, she reminded herself, was still inside. She had to be. The sound of creaking wood beneath her feet broke her trance as she stepped onto the porch. The boards were uneven, some of them rotting, and each step felt as though it might give way. She reached for the door handle, the brass cold under her fingers. It didn't budge at first, but after a moment, she gave it another pull, and the door creaked open. The air inside the house was stale, thick with the scent of dust and mildew. Ilara. Her mother's voice echoed from somewhere deep within the house, fragile and thin, like it had been carried through the years on a threadbare whisper. "I'm here, Mom," Ilara called out, her voice betraying the uncertainty she felt. She stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft thud. The inside of the house looked just as forgotten as the outside. The walls, once adorned with family photos, were now bare, the pictures long since faded or taken down. The furniture, though covered in dust, was strangely undisturbed, as though nothing had been touched in years. A single lamp flickered dimly in the corner of the living room, casting long, ghostly shadows against the walls. "Ilara, dear." Her mother's voice came again, this time closer. Ilara made her way through the house, each step an echo in the silence. She found her mother in the back room, her frail form sitting in a high-backed chair by the window. The once vibrant woman was now nothing more than a shadow of herself, her skin drawn tight over bones, her eyes sunken. But when she looked up at Ilara, there was a flicker of recognition, of love. "Ilara," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I'd lost you forever." "I'm here now, Mom," Ilara said, her throat tight. She knelt beside her mother, her hand trembling as she reached to touch her arm. "I'm not going anywhere." Her mother's fingers grasped her hand, and for a moment the warmth of her touch almost made Ilara forget everything. The house, the strange feelings that had begun to creep over her, the memories she had tried so desperately to forget. But then her mother's grip tightened, and Ilara looked up to meet her eyes. "There's something in this house," her mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something wrong. It's been here for years, watching us." Ilara frowned, confusion flashing in her chest. "What do you mean, Mom?" But her mother didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes slowly, and for a moment, Ilara thought she might fall asleep. But then, her mother's lips parted in a final whispered breath. "It's not safe, Ilara. He's still here. He never left." A chill ran down Ilara's spine. Her heart skipped a beat. Her father. He had never left. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening crash, and Ilara spun around, her pulse racing. But there was no one there. Just the oppressive silence. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, thicker, as though they were closing in on her. And in that moment, she realized that the house, with all its forgotten memories, was not as empty as it seemed. Something was watching her, something that had been waiting. The quiet of the house wrapped around Ilara like a shroud, suffocating her, pressing down on her chest with each passing second. Her mother had fallen into a restless sleep, her frail body slumping further into the chair, as though it was the only place that could hold her. Ilara stayed by her side for a while, watching her mother's shallow breathing. But the stillness in the room felt unbearable. She had to get away from it, even for a moment. Slipping quietly from the room, Ilara moved through the house, the floorboards groaning beneath her footsteps, as though the house itself was waking. The oppressive silence felt heavy now, more pronounced than before. The walls that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to close in on her, suffocating the very air she breathed. She could hear the faintest of whispers just beyond the edges of her hearing, like an old memory trying to claw its way to the surface. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by the flickering light of a solitary lamp in the corner. She passed the small alcove where her father's favorite chair used to sit, an old leather armchair that had worn with time, its cushions sagging with years of use. But it was gone now, replaced by an empty space. There was no trace of it, nothing to suggest that it had ever been there. Ilara's throat tightened, her pulse quickening as she stepped further into the hallway. She passed the door to her father's study. The door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for her. She had always been drawn to this room when she was a child, finding comfort in the smell of old books and the soft creak of the leather-bound journals that lined the shelves. Her father had been an enigmatic man, and the study had been his sanctuary, his place of retreat. But now the door seemed to beckon her, as if there was something important inside, something she had forgotten, or something she was meant to find. Ilara paused for a moment, her hand resting on the door handle. She wasn't sure why, but her heart hammered in her chest. There was something about this room that felt different now, darker, colder. Her fingers trembled as she pushed the door open, the hinges creaking as if reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. The study was exactly as she remembered it. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that smelled of dust and leather. A large wooden desk stood in the center of the room, papers scattered haphazardly across its surface. The light from the hallway cast long shadows across the room, distorting the furniture, turning it into strange, ghostly shapes. Everything seemed frozen in time, as though the study had been preserved in some kind of suspended animation. But as Ilara stepped further into the room, she noticed something out of place, a faint shimmer in the air. She turned, eyes darting, toward the back of the room. There, in the far corner, a small wooden chest sat on the floor. It hadn't been there before. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. The chest was old, weathered with age, its surface etched with strange symbols that she didn't recognize. She stepped closer, drawn to it, as if it were a magnet, its presence impossible to ignore. Her fingers hovered over the lid, hesitating just above the tarnished metal clasp. Something inside her screamed to stop, to leave it alone, but she couldn't. She had to know what was inside. With a soft click, she released the clasp and lifted the lid. The faint smell of stale air rose from the chest, mingling with the dust that had accumulated on its surface. Inside, wrapped in yellowing cloth, was a stack of old journals. Ilara's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the familiar handwriting on the first journal, her father's. She lifted it carefully, brushing the cloth aside to reveal the worn leather cover beneath. Her hands trembled as she flipped it open. The pages inside were filled with neat, deliberate writing. Her father's voice, so familiar, filled her mind as she read the words aloud in a whisper. "The house will not let go. It has taken something from me. It watches, waits. I must finish what I started before it consumes us both. Her throat tightened as she turned the page. The words were no longer clear, the writing becoming more frantic, as if her father had been losing control of his thoughts. I can hear it in the walls, its voice like a whisper on the wind. It comes for me. I am not safe here. I never will be again. Ilara's fingers shook as she turned another page, but this time there was a sketch. A crude drawing of the house, its outline jagged and distorted, as if seen through the eyes of someone who had lost touch with reality. And within the sketch was something else, a figure, shadowed and indistinct, standing in the doorway of the house. A chill crawled up Ilara's spine as she stared at the drawing. She could feel the hair on the back of her neck rise, the same sensation she had felt earlier when the door to her mother's room had slammed shut by itself. She quickly closed the journal, her heart racing, and set it back into the chest, as though the words had become too much to bear. But the silence in the room was broken by the faintest sound, a rustling, a whispering, like something moving just behind her. She spun around, her eyes darting toward the far corner of the room. The shadows seemed to shift there, stretching unnaturally along the walls. The air had grown cold, a biting chill that sank into her skin. Ilara. The whisper came again, this time louder, clearer, almost like a name spoken from the depths of her memory. She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was her father's. Ilara, don't you see? It's coming for you too. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls tightening, the shadows lengthening. She turned toward the door, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. But before she could take a step, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, the sound of wood splintering against the force. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her body pressed against the far wall. Her mind was racing. Her father's voice, the journals, the shadows, it all swirled together in a frenzy of confusion. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of this house before it consumed her too. But the door wouldn't open. The knob twisted. But it was as if something or someone was holding it shut from the other side. Ilara, it has begun. Her father's voice whispered again, this time sounding more distant, fading away like a memory slipping into the ether. There's no escape from the house. The air grew heavier, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, her panic rising like a wave crashing over her. She turned to face the room, feeling the presence of something unseen, something ancient, something that had been waiting. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. Movement. A shadow flickering just outside her line of sight. It was gone in an instant, but the chill that followed it remained, as though it had brushed past her in the dark. Without thinking, Ilara pushed herself away from the wall, her hand fumbling for the door handle again. But the whispers were louder now, swirling around her, mocking her attempts to escape. The door wouldn't budge. She had no choice but to face whatever was lurking in the dark. The chill from the shadows still clung to Ilara's skin as she stumbled away from her father's study, her mind spinning with the words she had read and the voice that had echoed through the room. The house was suffocating, the walls pressing in, the air thick with something heavy and unseen. She needed to escape, needed to breathe, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway stretched out before her, the low light casting long, angular shadows that danced like ghosts. Her footsteps echoed off the walls, the sound sharp and dissonant in the stillness. She hadn't realized how disoriented she'd become until she found herself standing before the attic door. She had not intended to go there. Not yet. But the pull was too strong. The door creaked under her touch as she pushed it open. The staircase leading up to the attic was narrow, the steps worn from years of use. Dust rose in the air with each movement, choking the space. Ilara's heart beat faster. the anticipation of entering the attic like a drumbeat in her chest. The attic was just as she remembered it, dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb that cast jagged shadows along the walls. The air smelled of old wood, mildew, and forgotten things. The clutter of years was strewn around her: cardboard boxes, old furniture, antique lamps covered in white sheets, and faded books scattered in haphazard piles. It was a place frozen in time, filled with remnants of a past she had long since tried to leave behind. But then her gaze fell upon something at the far corner of the attic. A large, ornate mirror stood there, propped against the wall, its frame intricately carved with symbols she couldn't place. She had forgotten about it, or perhaps had pushed the memory of it deep into her mind, unwilling to face it. But now, standing before it, the mirror seemed to call to her, its surface reflecting a version of the room that seemed wrong. It looked colder, darker, as though the house itself had seeped into its reflection. Her feet moved toward the mirror, almost of their own accord, drawn to it by some unseen force. The air in the room grew even colder as she approached. Her breath came in shallow bursts, fogging up in front of her face, mixing with the strange stillness of the room. Elara reached out slowly, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the glass. The coldness of it struck her like a physical blow, sending a shiver down her spine. She recoiled for a moment, but then something caught her eye. In the reflection, there was a figure standing just behind her. It wasn't her own reflection. No, this was something else, something darker. A man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. His features were blurred like a memory out of focus, but Elara knew instantly who it was: her father. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but the room behind her was empty. No one was there. The silence was absolute, but the reflection in the mirror hadn't changed. Her father's figure was still there, standing motionless in the shadowed corner of the room. His eyes locked with hers through the glass, his expression frozen in a way that felt wrong, like he wasn't really looking at her, but through her. Elara. His voice echoed through the room, the whisper carrying with it an unnatural weight, as if it had been buried beneath layers of time, struggling to claw its way out. "You must find me. Come closer." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice, it was unmistakable. It was her father's, yet it sounded distorted, warped by something ancient and dark. Elara's pulse quickened, a wave of cold panic washing over her as she took a step toward the mirror. She wasn't sure why she moved. Something inside her was telling her to run, to leave this place, but her feet betrayed her, drawing her closer to the glass. The closer she got, the more distorted the reflection became. Her father's face seemed to melt into shadows, his eyes widening in terror, his mouth silently screaming. The glass began to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen force. Elara gasped, her fingers pressing against the surface as though trying to push through to the other side, to reach him, to pull him back. "Help me, Elara," his voice came again, but it was no longer a whisper. It was a guttural growl, a plea soaked in desperation and fear. "You have to stop it. Don't let it take you too." The room around her seemed to blur, the air growing thick with a dark presence that pressed against her chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. Her heart hammered in her ears as the mirror began to darken, the shadows within it swirling like a storm. And then she saw it. In the depths of the reflection, something stirred. It was a shape, a figure that emerged from the darkness, moving impossibly fast. A silhouette, tall and slender, with glowing eyes and sharp, unnatural features. The figure reached out toward her, its fingers elongated, its form shifting like smoke. Elara stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream, but no sound came out. The figure in the mirror was closer now, its hands outstretched, its form growing clearer with each passing second. It was something monstrous, something born from the house itself. A creature that had existed in the shadows for as long as the house had stood. And it was coming for her. With a cry of terror, Ilara broke away from the mirror, her hands trembling as she wiped her eyes, trying to clear the vision of the creature that lingered in the reflection. But when she looked back, the mirror was empty again. Her father's image was gone, replaced only by her own. Shaking, Ilara stumbled back from the mirror, her heart racing in her chest. Her mind was reeling. Had it all been a hallucination? Was she losing her mind, just as her father had? The shadows in the room still seemed to move, shifting at the edges of her vision, but the mirror was silent now. Still, its surface reflecting only the room around her. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She could still hear her father's voice echoing in her mind, and the image of the figure, the creature, haunted her every thought. The weight of the house, of the years it had held its secrets, pressed down on her. Ilara didn't know what to do. She had come here to care for her mother, to unravel the mystery of what had happened to her father. But now the house was starting to consume her too. She had always thought of it as just a home, a place of memories. But now it felt like something far more dangerous, something alive with its own dark will. And she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just her father that had disappeared. It was something else, something older, that had claimed him long before Ilara ever stepped foot in this house again. The house had taken him, and now it was coming for her. Ilara could feel her pulse pounding in her throat as she stumbled away from the attic, her feet heavy on the stairs, each step a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating presence of the mirror and the terrible vision it had shown her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but every exhale felt like a struggle against an invisible force pressing down on her chest. The weight of the house was growing unbearable, and her mind was starting to splinter under the pressure of its hidden truths. As she descended the staircase into the hallway, she glanced toward the living room, half expecting to see something watching her through the dust-covered windows, or to hear that voice again, distant and cruel. But the house was silent, almost too silent. The soft ticking of the clock on the mantel was the only sound that dared to break the stillness. Ilara forced herself to keep moving, her feet carrying her mechanically down the hall, away from the attic, away from the mirror. But there was nowhere to run. No matter which way she turned, the house felt as though it was closing in around her. The walls, the floors, the very air seemed to conspire against her, pressing in from all sides. The quiet was oppressive. She hadn't realized just how much noise the house used to make. The creaks of the floorboards, the soft whisper of the wind through the cracks in the walls. It had always been a home full of life, full of memories and sounds. But now, it was empty, hollow. A void that echoed with the memories of things lost. She wandered into the kitchen, hoping the familiar space might offer some comfort. But even here, everything felt wrong. The sink, the counters, the cabinets, all were covered in dust, as though they had been untouched for years. She ran her hand along the counter, brushing away the thin layer of dirt. The house had once been a place of warmth, filled with the aroma of her mother's cooking, the sound of laughter and chatter around the table. Now it was cold and sterile, like a tomb. "Ilara!" The voice came again, but this time it was not in her mind. It was in the room, faint but unmistakable. Her heart lurched in her chest. She turned, but no one was there. The kitchen, too, was empty. Still that voice, her father's voice, echoed in the corners of her mind, like a whisper on the wind, never quite fading away. Her throat tightened. She had heard it before. But this time it was different. It felt more real, more insistent. "Ilara, come back." She stumbled toward the door leading to the back porch, her hand trembling as it grasped the handle. She needed to get out. She needed to leave the house. but something stopped her. Something was holding her here. The thought of walking into the night, into the woods that surrounded the house, felt even more terrifying than staying inside. The forest was an endless expanse of dark shapes and shadows, and she knew that whatever was haunting this house was not confined to these walls. Before she could make up her mind, a sound interrupted her thoughts, a loud, sudden crash from upstairs. Her heart leapt in her chest, and she instinctively looked toward the staircase at the far end of the hallway. For a moment she was frozen, staring at the darkness above, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then the sound came again. This time it was unmistakable, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming down the hall. Ilara's blood ran cold. The house was empty, or so she thought. Her mother was asleep in her room, and she was certain there was no one else in the house. But the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. Her body tensed. She had to move. She had to find out who or what was in the house with her. But her feet wouldn't move. The terror that gripped her had paralyzed her, turning her into a statue of fear, her breath shallow and erratic. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room, just beyond her view. There was a pause, a stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow. It moved across the wall, long and distorted, like a silhouette of something far too tall for a human figure. The shape was fluid, unnatural, as though it was being bent by forces that didn't belong to the world. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, her eyes locked on the shadow, unable to look away, unable to scream. The shadow twisted, elongating as it crept across the floor, closer to where she stood. For a moment, everything inside her screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. She could only stand there, rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of the presence that had entered the house. The footsteps continued, growing louder, until they reached the threshold of the living room, and then there was silence. Ilara held her breath, straining her ears for any sound. But there was nothing. No creak of floorboards, no sound of breathing, just the deafening quiet that pressed in from all sides. She dared not move. She dared not blink. But then, through the silence, came a voice. Low, cold, and unmistakably familiar. Ilara, you should not have come back. Her father's voice, or something that sounded like it, reverberated through the room. It was wrong in a way she couldn't describe, as if it had been twisted by something ancient, something that had lain dormant for years, waiting for the moment it could speak again. Her legs finally gave way, and she sank to the floor, trembling. She looked around, but the living room was empty. There was no figure in the corner, no shadow moving. Everything was still. The only thing that remained was the cold, suffocating air. Ilara, the voice repeated, this time louder, more insistent. It came from the shadows, from the corners of the room. It's not safe here. It will take you too. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye drew her attention. There in the dark, she saw it. Her father's silhouette, standing just beyond the doorway, watching her with those hollow, unblinking eyes. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, as if the words were trapped behind a barrier. In a sudden panic, Ilara sprang to her feet, the adrenaline finally breaking through her paralysis. She ran toward the back door, her mind reeling, her heart hammering in her chest. But as she reached for the handle, a cold gust of air swept through the room, slamming the door shut with a violent crash. Ilara, the voice said again, now closer, the words dripping with something sinister. You cannot leave. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to go black. She was surrounded by darkness, by the same choking silence, the same oppressive air that had haunted her since she arrived. And then, just as quickly. The lights returned and she was back in the living room, the walls closing in around her once more. There was no escape. The house had her. Ilara's heart was still racing as she stumbled through the hallway, her mind a tangled mess of fear and confusion. The voice, the shadow in the living room, still echoed in her head, replaying over and over like a broken record. "You cannot. Leave." She tried to shake it off, but the fear clung to her, suffocating her, and the silence that followed was worse than the voice itself. The house, she realized, wasn't empty. It never had been. With shaking hands, Ilara made her way to the small study at the end of the hallway. It was where her father had spent most of his time, where she had once spent hours watching him write in his journals, his face always illuminated by the soft glow of his desk lamp. It felt strange to think about those times now. The study, once a place of warmth and knowledge, felt like a mausoleum, filled with relics of a past that had been irreparably broken. She hesitated before opening the door. It was slightly ajar, just like before, and a strange, almost oppressive stillness hung in the air around it. But she had to go in. She had to understand what was happening in this house. She had to know why her father had disappeared and why, after all these years, his voice was calling out to her from the shadows. Taking a deep breath, Ilara pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was just as she remembered it. Shelves of books lining the walls, an old leather chair by the window, and the large desk where her father had written. But there was something off about it now. The dust that had accumulated on the furniture was heavier, darker, like it had been there for years, untouched by the passage of time. The air was thick with a musty scent, a mixture of decay and something else, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the desk. The lamp that once illuminated the space now stood, dark, casting no light. Papers were scattered across the desk. Some were old and yellowed, while others were torn and crumpled, as though someone had been frantically searching through them. But amidst the chaos, something caught her eye. A leather-bound journal, thick with age, lay half hidden under a pile of crumpled papers. It was unmistakably her father's handwriting on the cover, its surface worn smooth from years of use, the gold lettering now faded and indistinct. Ilara's hands trembled as she reached for it. She had never seen this journal before, and for a moment she questioned whether it had always been here, hidden away, waiting for her to find it. As she opened the journal, the first page was filled with her father's familiar, neat handwriting, but as she read, her stomach sank. The house is changing. I can feel it in the walls, in the floors beneath me. It watches me. I've tried to fight it, tried to understand, but I am trapped. It's in the air, in the very essence of this place. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Her father had never written anything like this before. His journals had always been filled with observations about the town, the land, and his theories about history and folklore. But this, it was different. This was panic. This was terror. She turned the page, her eyes scanning the words, desperate for more answers. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The house has a presence, an energy that draws everything to it. I can feel it calling me, pulling me towards something in the depths of this land. It whispers my name in the dead of night, its voice soft and insistent. But I know it is not my mind. It is something else, something ancient. A chill ran down her spine as she read the words, her eyes widening. The house has a presence. Those words echoed in her mind. What did he mean by that? And what was this energy he spoke of? The thought of something ancient, something buried deep within the land, made her skin crawl. She turned another page, the ink now becoming more erratic, the words scrawled hastily as if her father had been losing his grip on reality. The pages blurred together in a frantic mess of words and symbols. She could hardly make sense of it, but there were fragments that stood out. It's coming. I can hear it. Feel it in the earth beneath me. It's waking. I have to finish what I started. The ritual must be completed. The curse must be broken, or it will take everything. The house. It will take everything. The words were a blur, a fevered scribble, but they spoke of a ritual, of a curse that had to be completed. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. A curse? A ritual? She had heard her mother mention something similar, but she hadn't understood it then. Now it seemed as though the truth was becoming clearer and darker. Her mind raced as she read the next entry, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. The last few entries were the most disturbing. I see it in the mirrors, in the reflections. It's not just a place, it's a being. It wants me, it wants all of us. My family. My blood. I can feel it in my veins. I can feel it watching me. Ilara's pulse quickened. Mirrors? She thought back to the attic, to the strange reflection she had seen in the mirror there. Her father had seen it too. Had he been trying to escape something? Was that why he had disappeared? And then, the final entry. It was written in a panicked scrawl, almost unreadable, as though her father had written it in a moment of total desperation. It's coming for me. I can hear it at the door. The house won't let me leave. It won't let me die. It's taking me, and it will take her too. The last words, "It will take her too," haunted Ilara. Her father had known, even in his final moments, that something was coming for him. Something that had been tied to the house for years. The house wasn't just a home. It was a trap. A prison. Ilara slammed the journal shut, her mind spinning with the terrible truth that was slowly unfurling before her. The house had been more than just a home. It had been a prison for her father. A place that had consumed him, body and soul. And now it was trying to do the same to her. But the journal, with its cryptic warnings, had one thing that stood out. Something that her father had written over and over again. The ritual must be completed. What ritual? What had her father been trying to do? What had he been trying to stop? The answers were somewhere in this house, buried deep within its walls. And Ilara knew that she had to find them. But as she held the journal in her hands, a strange sensation crept over her. The house was watching her, waiting for her to make her move, and it would not let her leave until the ritual was completed. Ilara's hands shook as she placed the journal back on her father's desk, the weight of its contents pressing down on her like a stone in her chest. The ritual, the curse, the warnings written in frantic, slashing ink. The truth was far darker than she had ever imagined. It was as if the very house itself had been waiting for her to uncover the secrets her father had buried. She could almost feel the walls closing in around her, the air thick with an energy that made her skin crawl. She couldn't stay in the study any longer. The room felt like a tomb, a place where knowledge had turned into madness. Ilara pushed herself away from the desk and left the room, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. Every step she took seemed to reverberate in the silence, the house echoing her every movement. The hallway stretched before her, its shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower outside, casting the house in an eerie twilight. The house was alive, with a quiet tension, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ilara walked cautiously, the sound of her footsteps too loud in the heavy silence. She felt it again, the sensation of being watched. It was subtle at first, a prickle at the back of her neck, a slight tug on the edge of her consciousness, but as she moved through the hall, the feeling intensified, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. She stopped, her heart racing, and glanced over her shoulder. There was nothing there. The hall behind her was as empty as it had been before, but the air was heavier, thick with an unseen presence. Ilara. The whisper was faint, barely audible, but it stopped her in her tracks. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't her father's voice. No, this was something different, something darker. The sound seemed to come from the very walls, as though the house itself was speaking, its voice seeping into her mind like a poison. She turned quickly, her pulse hammering in her ears. But again, there was nothing. No figure standing in the shadows, no shape lingering just out of sight. Only the oppressive silence of the house. She backed away from the hall, her heart pounding as she moved toward the staircase. The sense of being followed was overwhelming, suffocating, like something unseen was trailing behind her just out of reach. The stairs creaked beneath her feet as she ascended slowly, her eyes scanning the dim hallway at the top. The darkness felt deeper here, more suffocating. The air was thick with something that made it hard to breathe. She reached the top and turned down the corridor that led to her mother's room. But as she walked, a chill washed over her, the coldness seeping into her bones. The whisper came. Again, this time louder, sharper. "Ilara, don't..." The voice was unmistakable now. It was her mother's. Ilara froze in place. She had heard that voice only hours ago, weak and fragile as her mother had called out to her. But this was different. This wasn't the voice of the woman who had raised her, the woman who had slipped into a frail, almost dreamlike state. This was something else. The words were not words of warning, but of desperation, of fear. "Ilara, please," the voice whispered again, almost pleading. "Don't stay here, you have to leave." Her heart twisted painfully in her chest as she moved toward her mother's room. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness waiting on the other side. The house seemed to exhale around her, the walls groaning softly, as if shifting, in response to her presence. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling as she pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. Her mother's room was bathed in shadow, the only light coming from the small lamp beside the bed. Her mother lay there, curled up beneath the covers, her frail body barely visible beneath the sheets. Ilara could see the rise and fall of her mother's chest, the shallow breathing that marked her fragile state. But there was something else. Something wrong. Her mother's eyes were open wide and unblinking, staring directly at Ilara with an expression of pure terror. The air in the room was thick with a palpable sense of dread, as though something was pressing down on both of them. "Ilara," her mother's voice came again, but this time it wasn't her. It was a distorted, twisted version of her mother's voice, echoing in the room like a death rattle. "Ilara, don't look at me." The room seemed to close in on Ilara, the walls tightening with every breath she took. Her skin crawled as a cold, unnatural wind swept through the room, sending a chill up her spine. She tried to move toward her mother, but her legs felt heavy, as though the very floor beneath her was pulling her back. She reached for her mother's hand, but as she did, her mother's form began to shift. The body beneath the covers writhed and twisted, contorting into something inhuman. Ilara gasped, stumbling back in horror as she watched her mother's features melt and warp, becoming a grotesque, twisted version of the woman she had once known. Her mother's face stretched, elongating, her eyes bulging as they fixed on Ilara with an unblinking stare. The skin on her face split open, revealing something beneath, something dark and writhing, a mass of shadows that seemed to move and pulse, as if alive. "Ilara," the voice came again, but now it was a low, guttural growl. "It's not her. It's not me." The creature that had once been her mother reached out a long, twisted hand, its fingers impossibly elongated. The skin stretched tight like paper. Ilara could feel the icy grip of fear in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she backed away from the bed. But the creature wasn't done. It reached for her again, its hand closing in with terrifying speed. "Ilara," the whisper, came from behind her, in the shadows of the room. Ilara spun around, her heart in her throat, but the room was empty. There was no one there. The walls seemed to pulse, and the shadows seemed to deepen, as if the very house itself were alive, watching her, moving with intent. She backed away, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the nightmare she had just witnessed. Her mother, her real mother, was still in the bed, her frail body still breathing, still alive. But what had just been in front of her? What had she seen? It was as though something had taken her mother's form, something dark and twisted that had come to torment her. The door to the room slammed shut with a force that made the walls tremble. Ilara gasped, her hands flying to the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on the door, desperation rising in her chest. The air was thick, and the house seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing down, the darkness growing deeper, darker, as if it were consuming everything in its path. "Help me," Ilara whispered, her voice trembling, barely a sound. She could feel the weight of the house bearing down on her, suffocating her. The whispers were growing louder, surrounding her until they were deafening, the walls alive with their voices. The presence was closing in on her, relentless, suffocating. She had to escape. She had to break free. Ilara's heart was racing, her pulse thudding in her temples as she backed away from the door to her mother's room. The creature, her mother's twisted form, had disappeared, and yet the air still felt heavy with its presence, like the room itself had been tainted by something ancient and dark. The shadows in the hallway felt colder now, sharper, as though the house had grown aware of her fear, feeding off of it. She turned and ran, not caring where her feet carried her, only knowing that she had to get out of that suffocating space, away from the unbearable weight of the house's gaze. Her legs moved almost of their own accord, and before she knew it, she was back in the study, slamming the door shut behind her, as if she could lock out the creeping terror. Her father's journal lay open on the desk where she had left it, its pages heavy with the words that had now consumed her every thought. The ritual, the curse, the whispers in the dark. There was no escaping it. She could feel the house pressing in on her, its presence growing stronger with every breath she took. The house had been waiting for her, and now it had her in its grip. Ilara closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath. The fear was unbearable, suffocating, but beneath it, something else was growing, something she couldn't ignore. The knowledge she had uncovered in her father's journal, the truth buried deep in the pages, gnawed at her. Her father had known. He had known what was happening here, what had been happening to their family for generations. The house, the curse, the ritual, it was all tied together. She opened the journal again, her fingers trembling as she flipped back through the pages. The writing was frenzied now, each word more desperate than the last. It was as though her father had been racing against time, trying to uncover something that would stop whatever force had taken hold of him and of their family. Her eyes landed on a passage near the end of the journal, one that was clearer, more deliberate. It described the origins of the curse, the reason the house had become what it was, and the ritual that had to be performed to break it. The words seemed to pulse in the dim light of the study, as if they were alive. It was never just a house. It was built on the site of something ancient, something older than the land itself. The spirits here are not the souls of the dead. They are something more, something worse. The house is the prison, the ritual is the key, and the blood is the price. The blood. Ilara's breath caught in her throat as she read those words. Her father had been trying to stop the ritual, to prevent the cycle from continuing, but something had gone wrong. The ritual required a sacrifice, a life to feed, the darkness that had taken root here. Her father had fought it, but he had failed, and now it was her turn. The walls of the study seemed to close in on her as she processed the gravity of what she had read. Her mind spun with the implications. Was the house calling her to complete the ritual? Had it always been her destiny to do this? Was she meant to be the final piece in this horrific puzzle? The one to finish the cycle her father had failed to stop? The air grew heavier, suffocating her, the shadows in the corners of the room deeper, darker. She could almost feel something reaching out from the darkness, its fingers curling around her heart. The house was alive, and it was pulling her into its web. Ilara slammed the journal shut, her mind whirling. There had to be another way. There had to be a way to stop this, to escape the grip of this place. But the house had always known, hadn't it? It had been waiting for her. She could feel it. The blood was the key, the sacrifice, but who would it be? The flickering light from the lamp cast odd, stretching shadows across the room. And Ilara suddenly felt as though she were being watched from every corner. She glanced up quickly, her heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing there. Just the oppressive, suffocating silence of the house. Her father had written about a mirror, a reflection of something more than what was seen. He had spoken of it as a warning, something to be avoided at all costs. The mirror. It was somehow tied to the ritual, to the curse. But how? What had he seen in it? What had he meant when he said the house was not just a house? The house was the vessel. The mirror was the doorway. Ilara's thoughts whirled in a chaotic spiral as she stood there, frozen in place. She had to find the mirror. She had to understand what it was, what it had to do with the ritual, and why her father had been so obsessed with it. She had to know what had been hidden from her all these years. She had to confront whatever waited in the reflection. The house creaked around her, the wood groaning as if it had a life of its own. The air seemed to pulse with a dark energy, pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel the walls around her, the house's heartbeat thudding in her chest. It was alive. It was waiting. Ilara grabbed the journal, tucking it under her arm, and turned toward the door. She could feel it now, the presence that had followed her, that had been lingering in the shadows since she stepped back into this house. It was closing in on her, but she didn't dare stop. She had to find the mirror. She had to know the truth. As she stepped into the hallway, the house seemed to shift around her, the shadows creeping into the corners of her vision. The whispering came again, soft and insistent, like a wind in the walls, as though the house itself was calling to her. Ilara. She froze, the sound of her name slithering through the air. It was distant, haunting, but it felt so close at the same time, like something behind her, breathing on her neck. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to move forward. The mirror. She had to find the mirror. Her footsteps quickened, the sound of her shoes hitting the floor, the only noise in the heavy silence. She felt the weight of the house behind her, pressing her forward, pulling her toward whatever awaited in the darkness. The air was thick now, each breath a struggle, the oppressive weight of the house pressing against her chest. She was almost there. She could feel it. The mirror was close. The reflection would show her what she needed to know, would reveal the truth of the ritual, and the blood that would seal its fate. And with each step, she could feel the house watching her, waiting for her to cross the threshold into its darkest secret. The house seemed to breathe around Ilara, its walls exhaling a damp, heavy sigh as she moved down the hallway, her footsteps quick and erratic. The whispers continued to echo, low and persistent, like a constant undercurrent beneath the silence. "Ilara, come back." The voice was faint, but it pulled at her, tangled her thoughts. She couldn't tell if it was the house or something else, something deeper, reaching out to her. The chill in the air wrapped around her thick as smoke as she made her way toward the door. She was close now. The mirror, her father's mirror, had been placed in the attic, where her father had hidden it from prying eyes, perhaps even his own. He had warned her mother about it in the past, spoken of it in hushed tones, but Ilara had never truly understood the weight of his words until now. What had her father seen in it? What had he felt was too dangerous for her to know. Her fingers grazed the cold brass handle of the door, and for a moment she hesitated. The house was alive around her, its very fabric twisted with something ancient and malevolent. She had been trying to outrun it, to escape its pull, but it was clear now there was no escape. Not until she faced it, until she confronted the truth of this place. With a sharp breath, Ilara pushed the door open, and the night air hit her cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine and decay. The house behind her groaned, its creaks and sighs growing louder as she stepped outside. The world beyond the house felt foreign, and yet somehow familiar. The dense forest stretched endlessly in front of her, its trees looming like ancient sentinels, their boughs swaying in a wind that she couldn't feel but knew was there. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light filtering through the branches of the trees, casting long, eerie shadows that shifted and moved as if they had a life of their own. The forest was silent, too silent. No animals, no birds, no rustling of leaves. It was as though the entire world had fallen into a deep slumber, save for the house and whatever lay within it. Ilara's legs felt heavy as she moved through the underbrush, her steps slow and deliberate. Her breath was shallow, her body trembling, with an adrenaline-fueled anxiety that seemed to pulse through her veins. The forest felt oppressive, as though it was holding its breath along with her, waiting for something to happen. The shadows beneath the trees deepened, the branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, twisting and clawing at the sky. She could hear the distant rustling of leaves, as if something was moving just beyond the reach of her sight. But whenever she turned her head, there was nothing there. Only the thick darkness of the trees, the impenetrable blackness that seemed to swallow the light from the moon. Ilara, her name. It was whispered again, and this time it was not from the house. It was from the forest itself, a voice low and hoarse carried by the wind. The air thickened with an unnatural stillness, and Ilara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knew that voice. She had heard it before. It was her father's voice, but not as it had been in life. This was a darker version of it, twisted and distorted by something ancient and malevolent. Ilara, come closer. Come into the woods. The trees seemed to shift, their shapes flickering as though the forest itself were alive with hidden eyes, watching her, waiting for her to follow. Ilara's skin prickled with a sense of dread, but she felt herself drawn forward, the voice calling to her like a moth to the flame. Every step felt like a violation of something sacred, a step deeper into a place where the very earth seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The path before her wound through the trees, barely visible in the moonlight, as though the forest had deliberately hidden it from her sight. She walked forward, her legs moving of their own accord, despite the gnawing fear in her chest. The whispers were louder now, almost imperceptible beneath the wind, urging her forward. Ilara, come to me. The voice grew louder, closer, more insistent. It wasn't her father. It wasn't even a person. It was something else, something born from the land, something ancient and primal. She could feel it now, crawling beneath her. Skin, its tendrils reaching out to pull her into the depths of the forest. The trees closed in around her, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. The path twisted, leading her deeper into the woods, and Ilara stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She gasped, catching herself against the rough bark of a nearby tree, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. She glanced behind her, half expecting to see the house looming in the distance, but all that was left was a dark, endless stretch of trees, the forest closing in around her like a living thing. There was no turning back now. Ilara, her name again. It was everywhere. The trees, the wind, the very earth beneath her feet seemed to hum with it. The voice was not her father's voice, but the voice of something older, something that had been here long before the house, before her family had come to this cursed land. The voice of the forest itself, the land that had been tainted by the ritual, by the blood spilled long ago. She pushed forward, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the rough bark of the trees. The forest seemed to grow darker with each step, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. And then she saw it. The altar. It was hidden deep in the heart of the woods, surrounded by towering oaks and twisted vines that crawled up its sides. The stone was ancient, covered in moss and lichen, its surface etched with symbols she couldn't understand. The altar was a place of power, a place where the ritual had been performed long ago, where the pact had been made. The very air around, it seemed charged with an energy she couldn't explain, a dark, oppressive force that made her heart race. The whispers intensified, rising into a cacophony of voices, all calling her name, all urging her toward the altar. Ilara could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her, its power wrapping around her like a shackle. She wanted to turn back, to run, but her feet refused to obey. The wind howled and the trees groaned, their branches creaking as if alive. Something in the distance moved, something large, something with eyes that glowed in the dark. Ilara froze, her breath caught in her throat as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was her father, but not the man she had known. His form was twisted, his body hunched and contorted, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes empty pits that seemed to swallow the light. He moved toward her with an unnatural, jerky gait, his hands outstretched, his voice a low, guttural growl. Ilara. It's time. His voice was no longer human. It was the voice of the forest, the voice of the curse. And as he reached out to her, Ilara felt the cold grip of the past close around her. She was the final piece. She was the one the house had been waiting for. The ritual was hers to complete, and the forest, its voice, was calling her to finish what had been started long ago. Ilara, come to me. And with that, the trees began to close in around her, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo, and Ilara realized that the forest itself was alive, its heart beating in time with hers. The air around Ilara was thick with an unnatural energy, the whispers rising into a maddening cacophony as the forest pressed in on her from all sides. Her father's twisted form stood before her, his face contorted with unnatural anguish. His eyes, those empty, soulless pits, seemed to pierce through her, reaching deep into her core. His mouth opened, but the words that came out weren't the words of her father. No, they were the words of something ancient, something that had been here long before their family arrived. Ilara. The voice rumbled deep and hollow, as though it echoed from beneath the very earth. You are the final piece, the sacrifice. Her breath caught in her throat. The forest seemed to pulse with life, its energy drawing her in, pulling her toward the altar. Her feet felt as if they were no longer her own, dragging her forward against her will. The twisted figure of her father, or whatever it had become, beckoned to her with outstretched arms, his shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground. No, Ilara whispered, her voice trembling. She wanted to run, to escape, but her body wouldn't obey. She could feel the house, the land, the forest itself wrapping around her, tightening its grip on her soul. She tried to move, but her feet were rooted to the ground. The whispering, voices of the forest rose around her, filling her mind, drowning her in their insistent call. Ilara, don't resist. You have no choice. The figure of her father took a step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. as though the very air around him was heavy with some unseen force. Ilara felt her heart race, her chest tightening with fear and grief. This wasn't her father. It couldn't be, but the truth was undeniable. The forest had claimed him, twisted him into something else, and now it was reaching for her, pulling her into its depths. She forced herself to look away from the twisted figure, her eyes flicking to the altar behind him. It was old, ancient, its stone surface worn smooth from centuries of use. The air around it hummed with an unsettling power, a dark energy that seemed to crawl beneath her skin, urging her toward it. The symbols carved into the stone were familiar, though she couldn't quite place them. Her father's journals had mentioned the altar, spoken of it as the heart of the curse, the place where the ritual could be completed. But as her gaze fell on it, Ilara felt a surge of terror and realization. The ritual wasn't just about blood. It wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about something far worse, something that had been passed down through generations, a curse that had been festering in her family for centuries. The forest was alive, and it wanted her to be its final offering. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she stepped closer to the altar, her movements stiff, mechanical. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the shadows around her seemed to stretch, to twist and warp in response to her every step. She could feel the eyes of the trees upon her, the weight of their ancient gaze pressing down on her shoulders. The very earth seemed to tremble with the anticipation of what was to come. "Ilara, it's time," the twisted figure of her father said again, his voice low and guttural. His words were not his own. They were the forest's. "You are the final piece. The land is hungry. It demands its blood." She stopped in her tracks, the words crashing into her like a wave. The land, the forest, the house. It wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity. An ancient force that had been feeding on her family's bloodline for generations. It had consumed her father, and now it would consume her too. She was the last piece of the puzzle, the final sacrifice that would complete the curse and bind her to the forest forever. "No," Ilara gasped, shaking her head, trying to tear her eyes away from the altar. But the pull was too strong. She could feel it, an insistent tug, like invisible threads wrapping around her chest, squeezing her heart. The land had been waiting for her. The house had been waiting for her. The ritual had always been her destiny. Her father's figure lunged forward, his hands grasping at her, his fingers cold and skeletal. His eyes were wide, desperate, as though he was reaching for her not out of love, but because he had no other choice. The forest's power had consumed him, and now it was turning on her. "Ilara, stop fighting!" the voice of the forest growled, deep and terrifying, from within the figure of her father. "You are already ours." The words stung like a physical blow, and for a moment, Ilara felt the weight of them, felt the crushing inevitability of what was happening. There was no escape. The curse was too deep, the bloodline too tainted. The forest had claimed her family, and now it would claim her too. The land was hungry, the house was hungry, it would not let her go. But then something inside her stirred, something deep within her chest, something primal and strong. Ilara's breath came in short, sharp gasps as the realization hit her like a lightning strike. She had a choice. She wasn't just a pawn in the forest's game. She wasn't just a sacrifice to feed the curse. The ritual might have been written in her bloodline, but she could still fight. She could still break free. She lifted her head, her eyes locking with her father's, well, the twisted reflection of him, the thing that had once been her father. His face was contorted with rage, his mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. She could feel the forest's power tugging at her, wrapping around her, but she refused to be its prey. "Ilara!" The voice hissed again, more insistent than before. The ritual must be completed. It's too late to turn back. You belong to us. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the earth trembling as if the forest itself was trying to drag her into the depths. The altar loomed in front of her, its stone surface slick with shadows, waiting for her to make the final choice. Her heart pounded in her chest, but Ilara stood her ground, refusing to step forward. No, she would not complete the ritual. She would not be consumed by the darkness. The air around her crackled, the wind picking up, howling through the trees, as if the forest itself was protesting her defiance. The shadowy figure of her father reached for her again, his hands outstretched, but Ilara stepped back, her legs trembling with the effort to resist the pull of the land. She had to end it. The house, the forest, the curse. It all had to end here, and she was the only one who could stop it. With a final defiant step, Ilara turned toward the altar, her eyes narrowing as she faced the dark energy that surrounded it. She reached deep within herself, finding the strength that had been buried beneath her fear, beneath the weight of generations of torment. And with that, she made her decision. The forest, alive with whispered promises and bitter threats, seemed to stand still for a moment as Ilara's heart surged with purpose. The wind howled around her, the trees groaning under the pressure of the ancient power that was coiled tight in the air. The dark figure of her father, or whatever he had become, towered before her, his twisted form trembling with rage. His outstretched arms clawed at the air, but Ilara, though trembling inside, stood firm. Her eyes locked on the altar. The stone was slick with shadows, its symbols glowing faintly under the pale light of the moon. Her father's voice, distorted and guttural, echoed in her mind, but it no longer held sway. The whispers of the house and the forest, those voices that had tormented her since the moment she stepped through the front door, were now drowned out by something more powerful, more primal. The ritual, the curse, everything that had been buried for generations was pulling at her, trying to drag her into the same darkness that had consumed her father. But Ilara had made her decision. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the cold bite of the air a constant reminder of the danger, but also of the strength she had within her, strength that came from knowing she had the power to end this. The curse that had shackled her family for so long, the bloodshed and the torment, it would all stop here. Ilara, the voice growled again, but this time it was a mere echo, a fading shadow of its former force. Don't fight. Don't resist. You can't change what is already written. You are ours. Ilara shook her head, her resolve unshakable. She stepped closer to the altar, her body trembling with fear, but her mind clear. She didn't know how this would end, but she knew that she could not let the cycle continue. She would not allow herself to be the final piece in this horrific puzzle. Not like her father, not like her ancestors. She could feel the eyes of the trees upon her, watching, waiting for her to make the ultimate choice. A single heart-stopping thought flashed through her mind. What if this is the end? What if, in stopping it, I become part of it forever? But she swallowed the fear. She was more than this house, more than this forest, more than the dark force that had bound her family. She was not the sacrifice. She was the one who would destroy the ritual, end the curse, and free herself from this nightmare. She stood before the altar now, her breath coming in shallow, trembling gasps, and she raised her hand. The symbols on the stone seemed to pulse, in response, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The wind, the trees, the whispers. The very forest seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew that something was about to break. The shadow of her father lurched toward her, his arm still reaching for her, but she held her ground. Ilara! His voice rasped, full of longing and anguish. Don't leave me. Don't leave us. But it wasn't her father anymore. It was something that had once been him, something that had been twisted and consumed by the curse. She could feel the weight of his loss, the grief that he had carried, and it broke her heart. But this was the only way to end it. She could not save him. She could only stop the cycle from continuing. With a breath that felt like it might tear her apart, Ilara stepped forward closer to the altar and placed her palm against the stone. A cold shock ran up her arm, and for a split second, it felt as though the earth itself had taken hold of her, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The forest around her darkened, and she heard the ancient guttural rumble of the land itself, a sound that seemed to come from the deepest recesses of the earth. The shadows around her thickened, pulling at her, trying to drag her down into the abyss. The power that had been waiting for her, the power that had been written into her bloodline, reached for her like 1,000 invisible hands. Ilara. The figure of her father was closer now, almost within reach. His eyes burned with a hollow, desperate light, and his hand reached out as though he could still pull her into the darkness. But Ilara's gaze remained fixed on the altar. The ritual had begun, but this was not how it was supposed to end. She had the power to stop it. She had the power to change everything. She felt it coursing through her, like a tide of fire that burned away the shadows. And then it happened. The ground beneath her feet split open, a jagged crack running through the earth, as the earth groaned with the weight of centuries. A sharp, sudden force pushed against her chest, and she gasped for breath. The shadows around her swirled as if they were alive, twisting and writhing, fighting against the pull of the altar. Her father's figure lurched, faltering, as the darkness that had consumed him seemed to recoil, like a beast unwilling to be tamed. The voice, that same voice that had tormented her for so long, came again, this time in a frenzy, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. No, no, Ilara, you cannot do this. The forest howled, the sound of its fury rising to a deafening crescendo. But Ilara didn't flinch. She held her ground, and with a final surge of will, she pressed her palm harder against the altar. The symbols beneath her hand blazed with an intense light, the power of generations rising up to meet her defiance. A wave of energy surged through her, and she could feel the curse unraveling, the ritual breaking apart, its power splintering like shattered glass. The darkness that had clung to the land, to her family, began to disintegrate, dissipating into the air like smoke. The house, the forest, the land itself began to tremble, and with a deafening crack, the earth split open wide, swallowing the altar, the shadows, and the twisted figure of her father. It all fell into the void, a chasm of darkness that seemed to swallow everything it touched. The last remnants of the curse were gone. Ilara stood alone in the stillness. The wind now calm, the forest silent. The shadows no longer moved. The air was clear. The oppressive weight that had clung to her for so long finally lifted. She could hear the distant sound of birds, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. The land had been freed, but as she turned to leave, a soft whisper brushed against her ear. It's never truly gone. Ilara froze, her heart racing. She turned slowly, her gaze searching the trees. But there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow. Only the remnants of the forest, now eerily still. She swallowed hard. The curse had been broken, yes, but something lingered. She could feel it, like the echo of a nightmare, fading but never truly leaving. For a brief moment, Ilara stood in the quiet of the woods, the sun now rising on the horizon, casting the land in a soft golden light. She knew she was free, but she also knew that some things, no matter how deeply buried, would always leave a mark. With one final lingering glance at the forest behind her, Ilara turned away and walked into the light. The house, the forest, the curse, it was all in the past now, but she would never forget.